This week we'll be discussing sentence structure. So, what is sentence structure? When we are talking about sentences, we can view sentences as comprising several slots. And the slots are what we're filling in to develop a sentence. The relationship between the slots is based on different roles that words may take, which are their function, more than the parts of speech, which are their form. So, up until this point, we've been learning about sentence form, and now we're getting into sentence function. So, what are the systems of characterizing sentences? There are the system of two basic sentence slots, which would be the subject and predicate. The subject filling one slot and the predicate filling the other. In this philosophy of characterizing sentences, the subject occurs first and reflects the action of the state of the verb. The predicate is everything else, including the verb. And the predicate is also the grammatical unit made up of the verb plus other constituents following that. So this is the simplest view of sentence structure and essentially the most fundamental, because as we look at the next one, you have the three sentence slot types of sentence characterization, and where it's subject, verb, and object. And while this might be more representative of the more complex sentence structures that we have in English, not every sentence is going to have an object, versus every sentence will have a subject and a predicate. Even if it's a verb standing alone, the subject is assumed. So you cannot have a sentence without a subject verb, or subject predicate rather, but you can have a sentence without an object. So, but this kind of broadens the category. So in this three sentence slot structure, the subject is what performs the action, the verb reflects or describes the action, and the object is the recipient of the action. The verb and the object are both elements of the predicate structure, and subjects and verbs are always obligatory, but the object is not. As I was stating before, you don't always have an object. So if you look at the previous system of characterizing sentences about the subject predicate being everything that follows afterwards, that includes the verb plus the object. Okay, so what exactly is a subject? It usually appears at the beginning of a sentence before the verb. It defines who or what is the instigator of the action or state reflected by the verb. And remember, the subject is the noun, pronoun, person, place, thing, but it also can reflect a state of being. So like, excuse me, emotions. So the subject is who or what is the instigator of the action or state reflected by the verb. It depicts who or what the rest of the sentence is providing additional information about. Who's doing it? What's doing it? What are they, not what are they doing, because what are they doing is the verb, but who's the person or the subject, the noun, doing this. So the types of subjects, we have simple subjects, which are typically nouns or pronouns. We have complete subjects, which are simple subjects and all their modifiers, such as a, the determiners, the adjectives that might describe it. And then we have compound subjects, and compound subjects are subjects that are joined via conjunction, intense curiosity and sheer bravery. So there are two subjects there with accompanying modifiers. So the subject is typically a noun, which most often fills the subject slot. It can be a pronoun too, which must be nominative or subjective case when filling the subject slot. In other words, the pronoun must be in that he, she, I case. It can't be him, her if it is a subject. And that becomes important in your discussion of language disordered children, because sometimes we'll see children substituting objective pronouns for subjective pronouns. The subject can also be a noun phrase, which is formed by adding modifiers to the nouns or pronouns. And the subject can be a clause, which tends to fill the slot directly preceding the verb. It defines who or what is instigating or be referred to by the verb. And we will get more into clauses in next week's discussion and chapters. All right. Occasionally, the subject slot is filled by an adjective, an infinitive, or a gerund. But that's not what this typically is. But sometimes you do have a subject slot that is filled by those types, such as seeing is believing, the gerund example. We can also have converse subjects. I mentioned these earlier, where the subject is left unstated. It's just a verb. And these are called you understood subjects. It's understood that the subject is the person you. like it's directed towards you. The speaker's directing it to somebody who's within their realm. The reference is difficult to interpret or identify, though, without context. So that's very critical that we have to have context to be able to interpret that. You can't just have a you understood sentence without the context and know who the subject is. And then finally, the subject slot identifies the instigator of the action or state reflected by the verb. So we'll learn more about the verb in a minute. Excuse me. Now, the object. Remember, the object is not obligatory. It's not always going to be there, but when it is there, this is how we can describe it. Many, but not all sentences include an object. Sentences that contain intransitive verbs as main verbs often do not contain an object. So, going back to the form, the transitive versus intransitive verbs, we have the structure of subject plus intransitive verb, and we also have the structure of subject plus intransitive verb plus adverb. But if there's an adverb there, that's not an object. An object is going to be what's reflecting the action that's being modifying the action that's being done. So the only sentences that contain objects are the sentences that contain transitive verbs. The object is viewed as part of the predicate or constituent of the verb. It defines who or what receives the action reflected by the verb. The function of the object is very different from subject, but form of object is similar to subject because they both typically consist of a noun or pronoun. In other words, usually the object is going to be a noun or pronoun, just as it is in a subject. But whereas the subject is the person who is doing the action, the object is the person who is receiving the action. They are receiving the verb. So Janie breeds dogs annually. Billy paid her bill yesterday, are the examples the book gives. The object slot may be followed by additional modification providing further information about the action. So the object slot can get longer and more complex with additional modifiers. The object is the recipient of the action in a sentence. So the types of objects, we have a direct object, which is recipient of the action. Is the direct object often answer the question of what or who. The indirect object are recipients of direct objects that answer questions to whom was the action done and for whom was the action done. But not all sentences contain indirect objects, and not all verbs allow for indirect objects. So some verbs cannot have an indirect object, depending on the type of verb it is. Direct object tends to be immediate receiver of the action. And the indirect object tells who or what is the beneficiary of the action. The indirect object typically precedes the direct object. And the way that we can tell which one is the indirect object and which one is the direct object is to check if the word to or for may logically be inserted before one of the objects in the sentence. So the example, Dean gave her the papers. Dean gave Teresa the paper. So you could either say Dean gave the papers to Teresa or Dean gave to the papers Teresa. And obviously it's not going to be to the papers who we're giving Teresa. It was going to be we're giving them to Teresa. Gave them to her. So that's how we can identify the difference between the direct and the indirect object. The direct is what was being given, the papers, the indirect object being her or Teresa gave them to her. Finally, pronouns and object slot must be the objective case. So remembering earlier when I said a subjective case, he, she, they. In this case, to be an object, it must be him, her, them. So that's also important when you're talking about language disordered children. Although you will see objective pronoun substitution for subjective pronoun substitution more frequently than subjective substitution for objective. So the subject complement. Some sentences have subjects and verbs, but no direct or indirect objects, but they can appear complex in the terms of analyzing their structure. So this is where it falls into subject complements, sentences that include a predicate nominative or a predicate adjective. They provide further information about a subject and follow copular verbs. So you have the subject, the copular verb, and then the subject complement, which is complementing the subject. It's providing more information about the subject. The famous linguist was Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is referring to who the famous linguist was. It is I. Ginger will be famous. Who will be famous? Ginger. That's a compliment to the subject more than it is an object of receiving the action from the verb, because you can't receive the action of will. So this follows the pattern of subject, copula, verb, subject, complement, and a subject and subject complement refer to the same entity. The predicate. So this is the other slot of the sentence. Says the first slot being the subject, and the second slot being the predicate. The predicate is the action or state that is stated, asked, ordered, or exclaimed by the use of a finite verb. The predicate is actually everything in a sentence that's not the subject, the verb, and its constituents. The predicate needs to agree with the subject in terms of tense and number. And of course, that's important when working with language disorder children, because we often see subject-verb disagreement. So that's an important thing to note and remember. But we as English speakers know that predicates and subjects need to agree in tense and number. So the types of predicates. We have a simple predicate, which is essential predicate, usually the main verb of the sentence or the clause. And we have the complete predicate, which is a simple predicate plus all the modifiers that provide additional information about the simple predicate. And then we have the compound predicate, which consists of two or more simple predicates. So descended and evaporated, and the mist descended and evaporated. So the subject is actually doing two actions in the sentence. So furthermore, we have predicate categories. And that can be broken down into two categories: the nominal predicate versus the verbal predicate. The nominal predicates occur when the verb in a sentence is copular or an intransitive verb. So remember, the intransitive verb cannot have an object. It cannot receive the action cannot be received. So this is a nominal predicate. It includes primarily the copular verb followed by a noun, pronoun, prepositional phrase, adjective, or adverb. It is synonymous with subject complements. The predicate refers to info following transitive verb. The complement refers to info following copular verbs. So you use subject predicate for transitive verbs. You use a complement when it's following an intransitive copular verb. The types of nominal predicates. We have a prepositional noun predicate where a prepositional phrase follows the copular verb. Excuse me. Those are not your black gloves. No, I'm sorry. The bananas are in the basket. I was reading that sentence. Go, where is the preposition? Yeah. Okay. The bananas are in the basket. Where are the bananas? In the basket. The preposition is noun predicate, where the main verb is copular and a noun follows with no prepositional information included. Those are not your black gloves. The qualitative predicate follows a copular verb and provides qualitative information about the subject. The fish is absolutely delicious. She seems a little shy. Qualificative predicate. And then the adverbial predicate, which is a copular verb, is followed by an adverb. It is not here. The airplane appears far away. All right, so the other predicate category we have is the verbal predicate. It occurs when the verb in a sentence is transitive. With the types of verbal predicates we have, the verb standing alone, where the subject followed by a verb standing alone. Verbs may be modified by tense with auxiliaries. We have the prepositional object, where the predicate contains indirect objects or modifying information about place, manner, or time. She called with his calling card. John called from Alaska. We have the prepositionless object, where the verb is followed by a direct or indirect object with notified modification of the prepositional by prepositional information. The pan hit the table. You give her the money. So there's no preposition. It includes predicates that contain information about manner, place, or time. We have the adverb. Verbal predicate, where the verb followed by an adverb, sometimes with an intervening direct object. The clinician conducted the screening hastily. So in that sentence, the screening is the direct object, but hastily is an adverb modifying the verbs that becomes the verbal predicate. And then the adverbial clause is adverbial information is presented in the form of a clause. I will go when I am ready. When I am ready being the clause. So nominal predicates contain copulas or intransitive verbs, and then verbal predicates contain transitive verbs. So what are our developmental notes about sentence structure? In early language development is generally described by semantic relations expressed among sentence constituents, which are syntactic, not in terms of syntactic structure. In other words, when children are very young, really about Cecile's age, you talk about it in terms of semantic type of syntactic structures, not form, rather than syntactic structure. We're still talking about nouns and verbs and adverbs and adjective development. But when the children move into Brown stage 3, when MLE was about 2.5 to 2.99, syntactic structured terms are used to describe children's sentences around 31 months. So this is going to be Cecile, and let's see, she's 20 months now. It's going to be almost a year from now before Cecile reaches that stage of the syntactic boom. And we see true development of sentence structure emerge. And syntactic boom is really fun because they just start talking tremendously. At 31 months, they demonstrate mastery of subject, verb, object, and subject, copula, complement structures. But in addition to Brown stages, I believe it was Crystal et al. In 1974 developed a 7-stage process that can characterize children's acquisition of syntax, with the 6th stage representing completion of the syntactic system. So we'll discuss these stages. Stage 1 was a 1-element sentences, about 9 to 18 months. So Cecile was in that stage earlier this year, but she's moved past that because she's in the 2-word combination stage, 2 to 3 words. So stage 2, 2-element sentences, about 18 to 24 months. Children use sentence patterns that consist of 2 structural or syntactic elements. This week we were getting ready to go somewhere. I think it was yesterday. And about to travel, and I'm making a business phone call, and this and that. And Cecile gets out the cat food, and she proceeds to pour it all on the floor, and she goes, "Cat, cat, eat! Cat, cat, eat, eat!" So she was combining the cat noun and the verb eat. And I had to tell her, cat's not going to eat off the floor. But it's an adventure with a 20-month-old, believe me. But that's an example of one of her 2-word combinations. And that's about the stage she's in right now. Now, stage 3 is between 24 and 30 months, where you have 3-element sentences. This is where true sentence structure emerges, which is the subject, verb, object sentence structure that we're looking for. You develop subject, object, complement, expansion. You can begin to combine, or they begin to combine adjectives with nouns to expand subject slot, determiners with nouns to expand object slot, adjectives or determiners with nouns to expand complement slot, and depict true subject-predicate structures. I'm working with a student now who's been described as severely apraxic, but philosophically I fall on the side, and you'll learn more about this in the next semester, that if this child is language disorder and that they have such severe language deficits, it's harder to call it apraxia as much as it is maybe a phonologically based, severely phonological processing language deficient child. So I'm working with her at the beginning of the school year, and we didn't have basic actions. We weren't even identifying the actions of the pictures I was putting in front of her. So, we're getting to the point where she say read and eat and drink. And it's not that she didn't have those words, but she just wasn't doing them on cue. So now she has those verbs, and we're working on the plus ing. So walking, eating. And one thing she's starting to do that I can see is an increase in her syntactic structure, an increase in her MLU, is that she'll say read. And I'll say, well, okay, say the whole thing, make it longer. He read. Yes. What does he read? He read book. And of course, that doesn't translate into a grammatically correct sentence, particularly for a 6-year-old child, which is how old she is. But I can see that increased syntactic structure. So what I witnessed at the beginning of the semester was she was operating in that stage 2, maybe, between stage 1 and stage 2, 1 to 2 word utterances very limited, and now we're moving into stage 3, beginning to combine things more appropriately without me even giving the model, just adding to it because of the development in our vocabulary and our syntactic structure and knowledge. So And you'll see that in typically developing children as well. This is just a case of a language disorder child who is doing this at a much later stage than anticipated. So stage 4 is around 30 to 36 months, and this is where Brown stage 3 comes into effect. You have 4 element sentences that have the subject, verb, object, and become more complex and syntactically specific. The direct and indirect objects begin to be used with precision, and most varieties of nominal and verbal predicates emerge in this time frame. At stage 5, we have 36 to 42 months. They have mastered the clause and phrase structure rules. They have fully realized sentence structures. Fully realized sentence structures have occurred. And that's something to keep in mind. So 36 months is 3, 42 is 3.5. So by about 3.5 years old, we have complete syntactic structure. And that's something that's really mind-boggling when you think of our language disorder kids and how much they're lacking in those skills. And if you're seeing them at school age, like I typically am at age 5, that their language is comparable to the skills of a 3-year-old. And so it's really a stark contrast between typical language development and language disorder children when you begin working with children and becoming more familiar with what's anticipated and expected, those developmental milestones. In stage 6, it's 42 months. You have complete system completion. The major elements of syntactic acquisition are in place. And that doesn't mean you've mastered everything regarding syntax, but once syntactic form and function are achieved, you can start applying the pragmatic influences that are incorporated and refined, which is moving into their stage 7.